Welcome to this video on supporting behaviour positively. This video concentrates on understanding the stress links to behaviour. In order to support individuals with behaviour that can be perceived as challenging, we need to understand their behaviour. If we go a step back, we need to think about understanding and what does understanding mean. We base our understanding on our perceptions. And if we take as an example this Norman Rockwell painting, what do you see and what do you perceive? So we can see a little girl sitting on a bench outside a principal's office. She has her socks pulled down, she has a black eye, and her hair is slightly messy. That's what we see. How do we interpret the image? What emotions do we think the child is experiencing? Why do we think that? Do you assume that your interpretation of the image is the correct interpretation? Do you assume everyone else has the same interpretation? The first time I saw this picture and I was asked these questions, I saw the smile on the girl's face and I assumed that she was happy, carefree. That's why her clothes were slightly askew. Even though I could see the black eye, I had learnt as an autistic person that when people smile, they're happy. I was probably making an incorrect assumption, which I realised when everybody else that was doing this exercise had a completely different interpretation and assumption around this picture. So understanding behaviour is not just looking at what we can see. And when we have to kind of take a step back from that, what is behaviour? Behaviour is the things that we can see and hear. But understanding what we can see and hear is based on our assumptions and interpretations. So behaviours are concrete actions, verbs, action words. For example, smiling, hitting, swearing, running, crying, throwing chairs. You can reproduce all of these in a movie. Behaviours in themselves are not inherently good or bad. They're contextually appropriate or contextually inappropriate. Sometimes individuals do not take into account context when exhibiting behaviours, and sometimes behaviours are as a result of flipping their lid, and so are not choices, but instead are survival instinct behaviours. So for example, if a child throws a chair, and this is because they flipped their lid and they're in survival instinct, that is very different than if a child is choosing to throw a chair to see how far they can throw it. This would be inappropriate in a classroom and completely appropriate in a chair throwing contest that was held in a sports field. When we're thinking about behaviour, if we need to assume intent, then the description is not of a behaviour. So for example, if we say that somebody is listening, this is not a behaviour that we can actually know. It is an assumption. We assume that the person facing us, orientating towards us, possibly making eye contact with us, not talking when we're talking, we assume that they're listening.
Welcome to this short introductory video about Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, which explains survival behaviour from Healthy Possibilities. If you hold your arm upright with your thumb folded in underneath your fingers in a fist, the arm represents your spinal column and your wrist is the brain stem, whilst your thumb is the emotional parts of your brain and the fingers represent the thinking cap of your brain. The primal reptile brain is hidden underneath. When the emotions and thinking cap are connected, your brain is in optimal learning mode. However, in this position where your hand is wide open, the palm, the ancient part of your brain, the reptile brain, your survival instinct, is the only part connected to your brainstem, so that is what is in control. When your reptile brain is in control, your survival instinct is in control. A reptile primal brain keeps us alive. It makes sure we survive by engaging in survival behaviours. These are flop, drop, freeze, flight, and fight. When your hand is in this position with your thumb touching the palm, the thumb is connected to your brainstem. And our thumb here is representing our amygdala and hippocampus, the emotional parts of our brain. It's working and in control. Note the thinking cap of the brain and the mindfulness part are not connected to the brainstem, so they're not able to work. The emotions are in control. Unless we bring the thinking cap of the brain back down, it is likely that we'll go into survival mode, and our reptile brain will take over. Engaging in interoception activities, focusing on an aspect of our internal self, re-engages the thinking cap and the mindfulness parts of our brain and helps us to manage our emotions.
When we think about common classroom behaviours, writing, drawing, talking, screaming, running, let's think about why might someone be screaming? Their team scored a goal. They dropped a book on their toe. They are frightened. They're trying to be heard. They're excited. Some of these would be contextually appropriate and some contextually inappropriate. Let's think about what behaviour someone might exhibit if they're frightened. They might scream. They might hide under a table, run away, freeze, flop to the floor, or throw something at the person frightening them. Understanding the individual biological, neurological, and wider environmental, psychological, communicative, sensory context of behaviour is really important. We think back to the previous slide. Some of those behaviours would be contextually appropriate in some contexts and contextually inappropriate in other contexts. So the context in which behaviours occur are as important as the context in which they do not occur when trying to understand behaviour and look at why it is deemed challenging or inappropriate. Take the behaviour of screaming. When it occurs appropriately, for example, this might be when someone is frightened, or when they're cheering on a team who scored a goal, or when someone is screaming, "Stop!" to try and stop a child crossing a road in front of traffic. Screaming is appropriate in the swimming pool if you're drowning and you need to try and get help. It's also appropriate if you're on a plane and it drops suddenly and you are bounced out of your seat. However, screaming is inappropriate if you're in a theatre and you're frightened by something the actors do and you disturb everyone around you. If you're in church and you see a spider, it's inappropriate to scream. If you're in a cafe that's really busy, if you spill a drink, it would be inappropriate to scream. Screaming at a wedding would also be seen inappropriately. And if you're on a plane and it's taking off and there's minimal turbulence, if you started to scream, that would be seen as inappropriate. So the contexts are really important. Now think about a child or student that you work with, or a client, possibly even yourself. Think about how this person learns. When can they learn best? And who do they learn best from? When are they most relaxed? When are they most stressed or distressed? And when is their behaviour most difficult for them, you? And is this the same or different? So, in your notes on the questions before, did you cover the preferred subject matter, preferred place, emotional state, physical mental health, preferred person to learn from, preferred medium, written, audio, video, etc., and anything else, any other contextual factors such as temperature, weather, clothing, hunger, thirst, communication type being used or required, etc. All these contexts are really important when we're thinking about behaviour and stress links to behaviour. This is because we can't learn or be relaxed all the time. If you want further information from this, the resources can be found at the Education Department for South Australia's website, public website. When we think about behaviour and we think about the links to the hand model of the brain, and we look at comfort zone and learning zone and panic zone, where are those behaviours that are most challenging to other people going to occur? There's a clear relationship between stress and our zones, whether we're in learning zone, comfort zone, or panic zone. Humans like to be in homeostasis. Homeostasis means balance, and our bodies like to be in balance. Our interoception helps keep our bodies in balance. So, for example, we have a sense of thirst that helps us ensure that the balance of hydration is right. If we have an interoceptive awareness of temperature, we know when to take clothes on and off, when to put the heating or cooling on in the house. So we are designed to be at homeostasis. However, to actively learn, we actually need our brains to be slightly sympathetic nervous system dominant, rather than being in parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system balance or homeostasis. However, it's a careful balancing act really, because too much sympathetic nervous system dominance due to a perceived threat leads to an inability to learn, and chronic SNS overload leads to physical and mental health issues in a feedback loop. The biological pathways of chronic stress are such that we have a perceived threat and we go into fight or flight or freeze or flop or drop or sympathetic nervous system overload. In the hand model of the brain, we do this. And when we're like this, the biological things that happen are increased production of adrenaline, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, more blood directed to the muscles so that we can fight or flight, dilated pupils, less blood to other organs, the kidneys, etc. Now, once that threat passes, for most people, this is what happens. So this is for people whose lives are fairly okay, who have control over their lives or power over their lives, those people who are not living in trauma. For them, their brain returns like this, and their parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Increased production of endorphins, reduced production of adrenaline, decreased heart rate back to resting, decreased blood pressure, less blood directed to the muscles, so more can go to the brain. The muscles relax, normal pupils, more blood to other organs, so the kidneys and the livers. However, for people who live in trauma, or for people without any power control over their own lives, when the threat has passed, they don't necessarily go back to this. They might, in terms of the hand model of the brain, just get to here. So they're still in big emotions, they're still on high alert, waiting, and the tiniest little thing can tip them back over into this. And they go round and round and round in that cycle. And chronic stress is known to make people go into that cycle more and more frequently. So what contextual factors can cause stress? Now, we need to think about the individuals that you're supporting, teaching or working with, or in your family or you or yourself. Are any of these possible factors contributing to a build-up of chronic stress? So think about communication differences. If you're a person who uses sign and no one in your life uses sign, would that eventually build up to chronic stress? What about for people with a lack of agency or control over their own life choices? Could you imagine having no choice over what to eat or drink ever, or even when to eat or drink ever, what clothes that you could wear? What about sensory input that you perceive as distressing or unpleasant? So for me, I don't like neon fluoro lights. If I have to sit under one for half an hour, it's distressing. But if I have to sit under one every single day from 9 till 5, that might cause chronic stress. What about if you have difficulty comprehending or difficulty completing tasks or work being given to you? What about if you're hungry every day? What about if you're chronically dehydrated, constipation, poor physical health? What other contextual factors can you think of? Now think about yourself and think about your default settings, if you like. Are you a really laid back, chilled person? Has a massive comfort zone? How big is your learning zone? And what about your panic zone? So I have a fairly large panic zone, a fairly large learning zone, and quite a small comfort zone. Some other people might have more balanced learning, comfort and panic zones. And some people have a very small panic zone. It takes a lot to make them panic and they recover quite quickly. Is the relationship between the zones stable for you? How does your body feel in the first part of your panic zones? Can you tell when you're moving towards complete panic versus being in low-level panic? How about if you're moving towards the learning zone? Have a go at completing the table. So, for example, for me, when I'm in low-level panic, this might be because I'm in a situation that's uncomfortable for me. A bus in a strange city. I don't know where to get off. What signals would I be getting from my body? So that's my interoceptive awareness. Well, my muscles in my shoulders and my back get quite tense when I'm in low-level panic. And what could I or someone else do to help? In that instance, if I was on a bus in a strange city, I could open up a bus map or app to tell me when to get off the bus. Or I could ask somebody else. However, if I don't do that, I'll quite probably move into complete panic. And when I'm in complete panic, it's because I'm lost or I feel out of control. And the signals that I get from my body is that my head will hurt and my muscles in my back and shoulders will be extremely tight. And at that point, the best thing people can do to help is to tell me that they'll give me the space to calm down and then to leave me until I'm ready to be supported to come out of being lost. How did you go with yours? Now let's think about the impact of neurodiversity on the zones of regulation. So for neurodiverse people such as myself, the edge between learning and panic can be fuzzy. The comfort zone, for example, might be minuscule too, or the learning zone might be minuscule. Now what I mean by fuzzy and minuscule is somebody might only be comfortable in one particular place, one particular context. They might only learn in one particular pace or context or about one particular thing. And generally that would be fine. They go from their comfort zone to their learning zone, it's okay. But a small thing has changed in their context and that can be enough to tip them over into panic. The panic zone can be huge in people who are neurodivergent. And we can't learn when we can't get into learning zone. So if we're always in panic zone, we can't learn. Now why does this happen? Poor interoceptive awareness is linked to neurodiversity, and it means that individuals don't realise they need to self-regulate until they're about to tip over into panic mode. So if we take our hand model of the brain, when this is happening for most people, they know it's happening. And they'll do something about it before they're in big emotion state. So they'll get themselves back down into the calm state. However, for neurodivergent people, this will be happening and they won't notice. Wow, big emotion. They and everybody else notices and straight into panic zone. Sympathetic nervous system overload. So There's a number of different forms of neurodiversity. We tend to think about autism when we hear the word neurodiversity. However, there is neurodiversity that you acquire during your lifetime, or what's known as clinical neurodiversity, which means that you're born with a neurodivergent brain. So that's a brain that's wired differently. And then there's applied neurodiversity. So you are born with this, but it's not a health condition, and it only matters when you're doing that particular thing. So for example, dyscalculia doesn't matter unless you're actually doing maths. The neurodiversities that you can be born with are intergenerational trauma. So we know that the children who are witnesses to domestic violence experience brain changes, and those brain changes are passed on to their children, whether or not their children have experienced trauma. Other things that you can be born with are things like autism spectrum, ADHD, Tourette's, and also fetal alcohol. And you're born with these conditions, and they relate to self-regulation and communication skills. Now, acquired neurodiversity is things like mental illness, neurological illnesses, brain injury, including trauma. So when you experience a major trauma, then that changes the structure in your brain. Remember that chronic stress biological pathways, when you go round and round and round in that stress loop, what happens is that you actually change things neurochemically in your bodies. However, with acquired neurodiversity, you could, in theory, return to neurotypical if the injury heals, but you could also remain as is, or it could get worse if your health deteriorates. The interesting thing about neurodivergent brains is that they're wired differently and they function differently. So, for example, neurodivergent brains may not filter input or output, but equally they may not notice input or produce output, and they can look different in different contexts. So, for example, a person who is autistic may not filter all the sounds and smells and sights that they're experiencing all the time. Within that, they may not notice an adult talking to them because they couldn't filter all the other things that were happening. They may be verbal in some contexts and non-verbal in other contexts. So neurodivergent brains perceive, process and produce atypically. One of the things around this perception is that they may perceive threats more frequently. And if we think back to the chronic stress diagram, it's the perception of threat that sends us from this to this. So when is it that behaviour that's challenging occurs? If we think about somebody throwing a chair, would they really be doing that when they weren't in their panic zone? Would they be doing that in their comfortable learning zone? We have externalising behaviours, such as throwing objects or damaging property, internalising behaviours, so these are ones such as hiding under a desk, under the covers, or not interacting. And then survival behaviours, which are fight, flight, freeze, flop and drop. And these look like running away, becoming immobile, dropping to the floor, screaming, running, hitting, kicking. So if we look at the interaction between our autonomic nervous system, which is kind of like a seesaw, you go up and down, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, when they're in balance, you're in homeostasis. And homeostasis is in the learning zone. However, you're not really actively learning and learning new things and getting challenged with your learning. The comfort zone, we're not learning at all, and that's parasympathetic dominant. When you're slightly sympathetic nervous system dominant, that's when you're in the best learning zone to learn new things. However, we push that too far and we get into big emotions. Push it further and you're in your survival mode. So when you're here, this is both comfort zone and beginning of learning zone. And here is also learning zone. Here is your big emotions, and here is your survival mode. So in order to support behaviour positively, we need to ensure the individual is able to be in their comfort or learning zone. Because the sympathetic nervous system, that's your stress and distress. and when that's too high, you can't learn. So we need to co-regulate and scaffold self-regulation so that people can exit the lower panic zone and not escalate to the full panic zone, so that they can come back down into learning zone. We need to be able to support individuals to identify contextual factors that act as stressors and chronic stressors, because these stressors are what can push individuals into full panic zone and prevent them from returning to learning or comfort zones. For things that seem to be very not mattering to other people, they can be really strong perceived threats to people who have chronic stress or chronic anxiety. So once we identify these contextual factors, we need to have strategies to manage and or avoid contextual stresses. And we can plan for these strategies and then implement them.